Hi, welcome to the video for the Leadership Learning Lab around team alignment and creating a kind of a team toolkit to be able to align your team. I am Erin Cohn. I'm the director of Worrell Center for Leadership.
Hi, I'm Annie W. Cohen, and I'm the Leadership Development Designer in the Worrell Center for Leadership.
Great. And so if you don't know what the Worrell Center is or you're not familiar with us, we are a relatively new center on campus. And our role is to sort of organize and cultivate leadership development experiences for students. We just adopted a new mission, which is to equip all members of the Smith community with the creativity, courage, and collaborative capacity to lead positive change at scales both large and small. And so we're really excited to be able to offer a set of learning experiences for students in the form of these sort of learning modules that will give you a chance to practice your leadership, do some reflection, get a sense of who you are and how you want to start the year with the groups that you are leading. So this particular module is about team alignment, and we want to start by just talking about what do we mean by that. It's really important when you get started with a team to align that team before you jump into work together. And teams tend to, you may realize this from your own experience, teams tend to think mostly just about the tasks that they're about to engage in and jump straight into work without stopping to kind of do some work to think about who are we within the team, how do we want to pull ourselves together, what do we need to know about each other before we begin. And so when we talk about alignment, we don't necessarily mean that we all agree or that we all see things the same way, but instead it means that we've done the work of getting to know each other. It means that we've agreed on a set of behaviors that we want to engage in with one another. And so that's going to allow us to engage productively with one another, but also to harness the diversity of perspectives and experiences that each of us brings to that work. And so this is really the work of a team leader. Like as the leader of a group, your job is to kind of set the container, create the container for that work to happen so that you can then help your team collaborate and move and work together moving forward. So Annie's going to talk a little bit about why. Why is this important?
So like Erin was mentioning, this container is something that creates a culture, right? And so sometimes we don't always recognize that what we're engaging with or whom we're engaging with is creating some kind of environment or culture. So what we want to do is bring acknowledgement to that deliberately and have you really think about what kind of culture do you want to create? What's the environment that you want your group to be in? What does that feel like? How do they contribute to that? It also, once you start to bring awareness to the culture, it gives practice and raises comfort level with surfacing any type of issues. So we'll talk a little bit later about how do you create norms and things within your culture that help you establish naming the elephant in the room or bringing in more fun or taking the pulse of your group. The other thing is that we also think that this is important because we want you to go slow to go fast. So what does that mean? Going slow to go fast means that you're taking the time to do this work to be able to function more effectively and productively with each other as a group. And it's also not just about how the group works or produces something, it's about how the group convenes together and the relationships that you're building. So it's in service of productivity, but it's also really to make your team members feel like, let's take a pause, let's get to know who we are as a group. Let's think about the different roles that are coming to play in that group so that we know how to really be effective as a team. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this in the task versus maintenance section that Erin will highlight. But this really is a great thing to think about, taking a pause in the beginning of establishing your group and think about how do I want to, what's the culture? Like what's the feel that we want to have as a group so that we can really feel connected and also do some really awesome stuff.
And like Annie said, it's a culture will form in your team or your group, whether you tend to it or not, right? So that, and if you let that culture form just as it forms, it may not go in the direction that you like. And so one of the things that we want you to think about as a leader on campus is, what is the culture that I want to create, and how do I help cultivate that? And what's my role in that? And so this video is all about sharing a set of tools, very concrete tools that you can use with your fellow students and with groups that you are a leader of, to help you kind of set that stage and set that tone at the beginning. So we see this as a toolkit. And so along with this video, you will get 4 kind of strategies or items that you can use with your team in whatever combination feels right to you. We're going to introduce them to you in the order that we think it kind of makes sense to use them. And so you might think about rolling them out, if you want to use all 4, rolling them out in this order. But you don't have to. You have lots of flexibility, and they're there for you to use as you see fit. All right, so we are ready to share this toolkit for team alignment. So the very first item in this toolkit is what we call a user manual. So the guiding question for this particular item is really, how can I know how best to work with you if I don't have instructions? And so we think about a user manual as a set of instructions that we can write down and share with each other at the beginning of working together as a team, that are sort of like the user manual you would use for anything else. If you think about like IKEA directions, or any new appliance that you have, like before you get started using it, you want to be able to have a good sense of sort of what is it that I need to know in order to do that well. And so when to use this is really at the very beginning of your work together, because it's a way to share some things about yourself and get a little vulnerable with one another, in order to kind of reveal, here's how I like to engage with others when I'm working with a team. So the user manual looks like this, and you'll have a PDF version of this that you can use and share with your team and have folks fill it out. And you can see that there are 3 different columns within this, with some prompts to do some reflection on. There's the self column, and thinking about yourself in terms of what brings you joy. What are some of the superpowers that you have that you bring to the table that are sort of important to you outside of your work within a team? Some understanding of your personality and identities that you want to share with others, that might have an effect on the way that the group works together. And so that self column is really about thinking about you. And then the group life column is really about how do you like to engage with others. And so thinking about your communication style, how you process thoughts and ideas, what you need from others in communication. What are some of the collaborative superpowers you have in terms of what do you bring to a group when you're working with a team? What are the qualities that you really hope you could have in teams that you're working with? And then finally, a column on the tough stuff, which is, in my mind, one of the most important set of things to talk about before you get started. And when we talk about kryptonites, we're thinking about that as the opposite of superpowers, right? Not necessarily here are my weaknesses, but rather like, what are the things that weaken your ability to be a collaborative team player? What kinds of elements exist in the world that, like, when you feel those happening, you shut down or things get tough for you. And also some warning signs. So if you see me do blank, it might mean blank, and here's how you can help, right? To give an example from our own team, because our team at Wordle Center for Leadership completed a user manual. We shared it with each other. For a warning sign, I shared that, like, if you see me shut down in a meeting, it's because I maybe am having some emotions that I can't sort out, and I need you to ask me what's going on and be okay with me saying, hey, I need a little time to process before we return to this, right? And so being able to get that on paper and share it with my team before we even get started working is a really helpful thing, because then it becomes something that they can notice and know about me, as opposed to having to guess about, why is Erin behaving the way she's behaving at the moment? Does it mean she's mad at me? Does it mean that we are terrible at working together? Are we going to fail? Is this all going to fall apart, right? Those are all really normal things to think. And so the user manual kind of normalizes that ahead of time. So it has a ton of benefits. It gives you the chance for individual reflection on yourself and a team. And so when we've used this with students in the past, they've often thought, I never really thought about this. I never considered these sort of ways of understanding myself as part of a group. And so it's a way to kind of really do some of that deep self-reflection. It puts on the table kind of what are our needs that we have before we get started. And it also externalizes what often stays below the surface. And so when you use this with your team, I would have folks complete it on their own. And I would encourage you not to just share. Sharing is important, but share and then follow up with how might some of these differences lead to conflict for us as a team moving forward? But also, how might we take some of the differences that we see here and build on those to become even more successful? Because there's so much research that shows that diversity actually leads to much better outcomes for teams. And so to kind of normalize that and to think about what can we see here that our differences, how can those differences come together to create greater success? So anything you want to add about user manuals, Annie?
Yeah, I think what I love about the user manual is it really gives the individual agency to choose what they want to share with their group. And then what's also great about the user manual is that you can use it at different stages in your group development. So this is a fantastic, let's get to know each other from the beginning type of activity, but also when you're doing some kind of check-in mid-year or even toward the end, just to take a pulse of the group, things about you might change or how you relate with the group might change. And so it's a great opportunity to be able to sit down and look at what you wrote in the beginning of the year and say, does this still apply to me? Does this still make sense with the group? Is there anything I need to morph or change? And what I also loved about doing this activity with our group was that it made me think about some things that I hadn't thought about, and then I could also doodle or make it as creative as I wanted, which also would help me gather my thoughts. So you really can tailor this to what your personality is and the things that you want and need to share with your group.
Yeah. One other creative way to morph this exercise, at the end of your time working together as a group, you could also create user manuals for each other, create a different kind of a template perhaps. And we recently, unfortunately, lost one of our team members who went on to a different stage in her career and left our team. And we created a user manual for her to take with her to that next job, which was a gift and a way of saying we love you, but also to help share with her, here's some of the things that we know about you and are a way of showing care with one another. So it's something to think about doing at the end of your work together at the end of the year as well. Okay, let's move to group norms.
Great. So the guiding question for group norms is, can we agree on how to work together? And so we're going to go back to what you're doing is creating a culture, right? And this is a culture that the leader might create the container for, but you're all contributing to as a group. So when you're creating group norms, this will allow both the leader of your group and other folks within the group members to be able to refer back to the things that you established earlier on, you agreed on, and then can hold each other accountable to. So group norms are a succinct set of agreements that allow groups to establish how they want to work together, communicate, hold each other accountable, and get stuff done. And it's important to highlight succinct because you don't want this never-ending list where you have 40 to 50 items of, I want all of these different things from each other. You want to be able to point to something in however you capture it graphically or in a design kind of way to say here are the 5 things that we need from each other, and these are our points of reference for our group. And these are all going to look different based on the configurations of your group. Like Erin had mentioned before, there's diversity within any type of an organization or a team or a staff. And so people are going to need different things from each other, and people are also going to need some things that overlap. So this gives you a foundation to be able to think about individually, what is it that I need from my group? And you can use your user manual to be able to build from there. So I know when I begin each meeting, I need to feel XYZ from each other. Or if there is some kind of conflict brewing, we're going to use this type of method to call it out in the group. Or if somebody's not showing up for meetings or there's a lack of motivation, you're creating these different types of tools that you can all refer back to. And they can be silly, they can be creative, they can be pretty standard. It's really up to you about how you want to do that. So these are things that are values and practices um, for your group, the things that we really care about, and we really want to make sure that we're on the same page. So we value communication as a group, we value timeliness, we value having fun, and you will establish as a group what those themes are. So the way that we suggest that you work on this is, again, you'll get a PDF of these just so that you have the instruction sheet about what group norms are or are not. And then how do we get to those? So we suggest that each person in the group take the worksheet and fill it out individually. And these are some of the guiding questions. What do we need from each other? And that can be about having an agenda, that can be about having fun, that can be about showing up on time, anything. How do we want to have fun? And especially in this culture of convening virtually, it's going to be important to have some lighthearted moments and some fun, right? So how do you want to establish that in this culture? How do we want to celebrate each other so that everybody feels like they're included and they're valued as part of the team? And how do we want to hold each other accountable? And so I would suggest that you take time and you fill these out individually and really think about, what is it that I need from my group leader? What is it that I need from my fellow team members to feel like I'm part of this group? And so you'll come back together as a team and you'll share out your answers to each of these. And I would suggest that you have some person that's taking note of everything, and you can capture it in a separate worksheet that's for your team, or you can put it in a Google Doc, or however you want to, display it creatively, and say, what are the themes that are coming up from each group member for these different sections? And again, like all the other worksheets, these are just some guiding questions. If these are not the right questions for your group, feel free to change them. So go through the sheet before you fill it out individually to think about, like, are these the questions that we want to answer as a group? Are these the things that we want to know about each other? Do we need these? Do we already? You might be a group that is pretty established from the year before, but only has a couple of new members. So you want to add some new questions or some revisiting questions. But you want to capture the themes, and then you want to have a concise list for each. So I would say probably like 2 to 3 max for each section. And once you do that, make sure that you're reviewing with each other. Are we actually on the same page? Do these feel right? Do they feel attainable? Are they realistic? Like, can we actually do this in practice? Yes, we want to call out conflict, but is this the way that we want to do it? And make sure everybody's voice has been heard in some way, so that people can really refer to this later on. This is a good exercise to do after the user manual. It's also a good exercise to do pretty early on in your group development, whether it's at a retreat or maybe one of your first or second group meetings. You can always revisit these and, like the user manual, check in to see whether or not these still work for your group. And we'd advise that you do that probably mid-semester. But this is a good thing to do earlier on so that you know what your group wants and needs, and how, like, what the norms of your organization are. Erin, do you have any thoughts you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say in my experience, group norms are only as good as they are practiced, right? So it's really easy at the beginning of working with a team to set up like a whole list of norms. And usually when I watch this happen, it's sort of wanting to make sure everybody's voice is heard so that it ends up being, like you said, this sort of like sea of things that we want to practice. And that becomes really hard to remember. And so the really hard work of forming norms with the team is consolidating into a list of things that are memorable, that we can continue to call on and sort of say out loud to each other. If they have sort of pithy phrases attached to them, one of ours at the Wordle Center is practice the preach, which means make sure that you are behaving as a leader in the way that you want to see students, like that we're the things we're trying to build in our students, right? That we match that with our own behavior, right? That's something that creates this short phrase that stands in for something else, like for something bigger. And so those are ways of making sure that you're reminding yourself constantly to engage in those. But this is hard work, but it's also really important. So great. Okay. The third tool is an exercise around the concepts of task and maintenance. And so the guiding question for task and maintenance is, how can we be most productive together as a team, right? And that's a question that I think the previous two exercises also help you with. But this particular exercise digs into a couple of concepts that we like to talk to students about when they're thinking about working as a team, which is that all teams tend to function within two modes of behavior: task mode and maintenance mode. And so what do we mean by that? So the first concept of task is that task behaviors are anything that the team and its members do to move forward together towards an external goal. So if your team, let's say you are a house council that is planning a party, like the task is planning the party, right? And so all the work that you're doing together to plan that party or that event is when you're engaging in task mode. So that's work towards a shared mission. It's progress towards completing projects. It's really all the stuff you're doing to get stuff done. Maintenance behaviors are anything that the team or its members are doing to maintain the health of the team itself. And so that means stopping to support and include each other, or doing that within the midst of engaging in that planning session. It means addressing conflict directly. It means making space for diverse perspectives. It means having fun, right? Enjoying each other, bringing joy to the work. Leaving space for that. And so maintenance behaviors are important for keeping the team in good working order. And both of these modes are really central to having a team that's really productive in working together. And so we wanted to give you this tool or this set of concepts so that you can start to think about them and how can we make sure that we engage our team in both of these modes of behavior. And so essentially what you are going to get as part of this toolkit is essentially a worksheet that you'll see that, or just sort of like an explanation page where you'll see those two definitions. So you can share that with the team members so that they have a sense, you can kind of have a conversation about those two modes and share that with students. And then we have this exercise where you can have each member place themselves on a set of spectrums. And so we kind of like spectrum work because it is a strategy where people can start to think about, where do I fit in the range of ways of thinking about some of these elements related to task and maintenance. And so there's this set of sort of 6 questions, such as the first one: when working in a team, I tend to prioritize getting things done or feeling connected, right? Or I find it difficult or easy to interpret the feelings of my teammates. And these spectrums give you a chance to not think about this as a black and white situation where it's like, I'm either a task person or a maintenance person. I either like to get things done or feel connected. You might find yourself somewhere in the middle. And so the idea is to put an X or a circle or somewhere, if you do this on paper, in that spectrum before you then engage with your team in a conversation about where does each of us fit on each of these spectrums. And so a couple of things that I would say before engaging with this particular exercise: there's no value attached necessarily, good or bad, to either side of any of these spectrums. All teams need people who are really good shepherds of task, and they need people who are really good shepherds of maintenance. And some folks live somewhere in the middle, and all of that is really important. And so just to recognize that there's no sort of like you want to be on one side of a spectrum or another. It's just that each of us is really different in these regards, and it's important to start thinking about kind of where is my comfort level when it comes to task and maintenance. There's also then a set of follow-up questions for you all to engage in conversation around. And you'll see that middle question, that third question about questioning the framing, is that you may dislike these categories altogether, right? You might think that these are false dichotomies. They may not feel like the right things. The whole point of this exercise is to get you started having the conversation. And so we would encourage you to question the framing altogether if that feels right to your team. That could itself bring up a pretty rich conversation, I think. So there's 2 ways to do this. You can either just share the PDF, have people do it, kind of an analog version, and then have the conversation. Or you can reach out to me. You'll see my email addresses at the bottom of this slide. And I can share this template with you through Mural, which is this it's like a platform that allows you to collaborate and create like virtual sticky notes and move things around. And so if you wanted me to send you that template, you could have this template, and then students would be able to put like an icon or a sticky note with their initials, or they could put even a picture of themselves on the spectrum, so you can see everybody's on top of each other's, which can be, I think, a really interesting way of engaging with this. So it's super easy for me to send it to you. It's way more fun and collaborative. And so if you want to go virtual, just let me know. Any other thoughts on task and maintenance, Annie?
I think the only other thought I have is what's really good about this is once everybody shares, the group gets a sense of how many people, like, is your group task heavy? Do you lean more towards one, or maintenance heavy? Or do you fall somewhere in the middle? So that you all have a sense of, wow, we're gonna need to do some more team building to make sure that we really honor the needs of relationships in this group, or this group that really is highly focused on getting stuff done. And it just gives some awareness so that you don't run into any issues later of, we're really stumbling, we have more conflict around relationships. Oh, right, we need to make sure that we're spending time having some fun and bringing the joy into the work. Or people are feeling really antsy about needing to get stuff done, and we need to spend a little bit more time on just having more productive meetings. But like Erin was saying, there's no value on either side, but it's really important that you have both existing in your team. Even if you're like, we're a task heavy team, that you still do some things to focus on the maintenance of how your group moves forward, because relationships will happen and they're important, and it's good to just have times to connect and revisit those.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would also kind of revisit the idea of going slow to go fast, right? Like a lot of times within a team, we get super task oriented, particularly when we get closer to a deadline. And yet a lot of times there might be tensions simmering below the surface, and those are potentially stopping us up from actually making progress on getting a task done. And so stopping to do the maintenance, even though that feels like you're going slow for that moment, is actually in service of going fast once you get through that and understand each other better, so that you can be much more effective and efficient in the task, right? And so they're actually interconnected with each other. People often see them as separate from one another, but in fact, maintenance is incredibly important, just like it might be on your car, right? In order to perform the task of getting from point A to point B, you've got to be able to do both of those things. They're both really important. So great. Okay. Let's go to number 4, which is a tip sheet on communication and accountability.
So this is less of an activity sheet and more of a guideline, and you can figure out how you want to use this for your group. You can make your own tips, you can use these as question starters, but really the guiding question for this is, how do we want to communicate with each other? This is the type of question that you should be asking yourselves, whether you're on campus or virtually. But virtually, it's really important because it's so easy to get distracted. It's so easy to multitask. It's really easy to zone out and not honor the different types of ways that we need to communicate to run effectively. So really stress that you think about, what are the ways in which we want to communicate, need to communicate with each other, and what are the potential barriers for that. Because doing things through Zoom can be so quirky and kinky with internet blocking out or people having access, don't always automatically think that people want to have the same type of modes of communication. So I would say that when you're having conversations with your group about how you want to do this, and you're using any online or virtual platforms, that you have backups as well. So if somebody can't get on via video, can they be on the phone, and will you have a note taker at the same time? Or how can you support those members of your organization or your group that don't have access, or maybe run into some Wi-Fi issues or robotic voices or whatever that makes it hard to communicate with each other, because inevitably that will happen. So what we suggest is that you go through some of these tips, and think about what are the questions that we want or need to go through as a group. So again, what are some norms and etiquettes for your meeting? Maybe you shut off all your other devices, or before we even started recording ours, we turned off alerts. On this Zoom call, we tried to minimize the other things that might cause distractions, because it's so easy to try and multitask. And if you only have so much time to capture your audience, you really want to make sure that your people are feeling like they're present. What are different ways of making sure that people feel like they're included and have the information, whether they're there or they're not? So your group might want to set an agenda ahead of time, go through that agenda, and also have a note taker. And that's way of people staying involved in the conversation. They're knowing what's going to happen during the meeting. They're not caught off guard. And if they can't participate the way that ideally they'd like to, they still have access to that information. It's also important that you think about, how do we want to communicate differently and more creatively, especially online? So it's easy to just have a Zoom meeting where you go through the agenda, but how do you want to bring in that maintenance piece as well? Like, how do we check in with each other? How do we make sure that all voices are included, so that someone is not easily checking out because it feels like a lecture Zoom versus like a collaborative meeting, right? So are there types of practices where at the beginning of each meeting, you do a check-in, or you have some kind of get to know you question, or some kind of team builder that brings the voices into your online space and gets people feeling like they're there, not just virtually, but they're present with each other. If you're having issues with communication, and this will go back to the group norms, talk about how you want to address those with each other. If you feel like the same voices are heard over and over at every single meeting, how can you check in with each other about like taking a step back or being aware of the space that you take up virtually? How do you encourage other voices to be present? Also thinking about, since there's so much that's happening with technology, how do you set boundaries around your tech use as well? So some teams might want to check in via text, or maybe they have a Slack channel, or maybe you're doing something like Erin had mentioned with Mural. But if you have 5 different ways of communicating with each other, and those are all pinging at the same time, it might feel overwhelming. So you might want to establish some boundaries and norms around how you communicate with each other. So we use Slack, for example. There's a channel that's just about fun and randomness, and people can contribute to that whenever they want. Or there's a Slack channel around productivity and this event that we need to work, or deadline that we're working toward, but we're only going to do that during the hours of 8 to 5. Like, think about what your group needs so that people don't feel like they have to be on all the time and checking all the different sources of technology that you might be using with your group. Make sure that if you have some meetings, because you may be doing classes virtually, you might be having various team meetings, that if you have meetings back to back to back, you take breaks, you incorporate that into your meeting. Maybe you have snacks. If you're doing things over a meal time, everybody gets to bring their meal to the table. Also thinking about the fact that ideally you want to be in a space where you can focus and not have as many distractions. That might not be possible where you are. So how do you incorporate that into your culture? The quirkiness of having your dog bark, or your family member walk by, or the TV on in the background, right? Some of those things are going to happen. And sometimes they can be really frustrating, and sometimes they are just something to embrace, that this is part of a new culture. So talk about what does your environment look like? And what are the potential things that might happen in your environment? How do you navigate it when there's too many distractions that come up? Maybe people mute if they're not talking, but you're also establishing that kind of culture of, this is who we are as a group, but this is who we are as a group within this bizarre, quirky, current norm situation, right? And that might look very different if we're sitting in a room in the campus center where we can tune things out. Or it might look like we're sitting in 103, 104, and everybody's distracted by that giant window. But instead of that, it's all the other noises and things that are happening around us. So find a way of incorporating that new norm into how you want and need to communicate with each other. What am I missing?
I don't know if I have much to add other than just that Zoom is just inherently awkward, right? Like it's like flat and you can't read each other. And sometimes you're like in the middle of a really exciting thought or deep, moment. And then, like suddenly you look like a robot or like you sound like a robot. I mean, there's just, it's a really hard platform to be having conversations, especially meaningful conversations. And so I would just say, like, say that out loud to each other, like acknowledge it and just be like, oops, that's awkward. And that's just how things are right now. And I think that the acknowledging it and sort of trying to move forward the best you can with it, the better it goes. Because otherwise it becomes this sort of, again, unspoken thing that's like, so, and also know that there are lots of people on campus in terms of staff and faculty who have, been trying to figure out this virtual collaboration thing, over the summer. And, we've been doing a lot of that work. And so rely on us for sort of help as well. If there are times where you're feeling like you need, things are feeling like they aren't going as well as you'd like we can help brainstorm ways to spice it up or do it differently, or, because we're all trying to figure that stuff out too. So great. All right. So the last thing we want to say to you at the end of this video where we're sharing all these tools is that, again, we would really encourage you to just get creative with this. Feel free to use and adapt these tools however works best for your team or your group. Use them in different orders, change up the questions. And if you are looking for a template that looks slightly different, I mean, we are absolutely open to, shifting things, sharing them with you, et cetera. Always available to give you some help as you are continuing to design this work with each other, but would encourage you to find some way to try to align your team at the beginning of your work together, using some of these tools or some other ones. So thanks for taking the time to check out these resources. Know that we are always available at the Wordle Center to support you in this work, and wishing you luck. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.